The Red Army had a strict rule about who could operate a T-34 tank. It required months of technical training, mechanical certification, and combat crew assignment through official channels. None of that applied to the woman who sold everything she owned to buy one, taught herself to repair its engine by lamplight, and then simply refused to hand it over to anyone else. Her name was Maria Oktyabrskaya, and the tank she built with her own money and maintained with her own hands carried a name across the Eastern Front that no military bureaucracy had approved and no general had the authority to take away from her: Fighting Girl Friend. This is the story of a telephone operator's wife who turned herself into a self-taught armor mechanic, financed a war machine out of grief, and then insisted on driving it into combat herself, repairing it under fire when nobody else could, and refusing to stop even when her own crew commanders tried to send her home. Before the war reached her, Maria Oktyabrskaya lived an ordinary life in Tomsk, married to a Red Army officer named Ilya Oktyabrski. She had spent years quietly absorbing the mechanical world around military garrisons, watching engines get stripped down and rebuilt, listening to the vocabulary of pistons, gearboxes, and armor plating that most officers assumed women had no reason to understand. When German forces invaded in 1941, she was evacuated east, and for 2 years she lived with the kind of uncertainty that defined millions of Soviet households, waiting for news that never arrived through official channels quickly enough. In 1943, she learned that her husband had been killed. The Red Army's telegram used the clinical language of wartime loss. Oktyabrskaya's response was not clinical at all. She sold her home, she sold her furniture, her clothing, anything that could be converted into cash, and she wrote directly to Soviet leadership with an unusual request. She wanted to personally fund the construction of a T-34 tank, and she wanted the right to crew it herself in combat. The Soviet state had absorbed private donations toward tank construction before, wealthy citizens occasionally financing armor in a show of patriotic sacrifice, but those donors did not typically demand a seat inside the machine they paid for. Stalin's own office reportedly approved the request, and by the autumn of 1943, Oktyabrskaya had her tank. She named it Boyevaya Podruga, Fighting Girlfriend. What separated Oktyabrskaya from a symbolic donor was what happened next. She did not hand the tank over to a trained crew and step back into a support role. She entered a formal training program to qualify as a driver mechanic, one of the most technically demanding positions inside a tank crew, requiring detailed knowledge of the T-34's diesel engine, its transmission system, and the mechanical stresses that combat placed on tracks and suspension components under sustained fire. She trained intensively, absorbing engine diagrams and repair procedures at a pace that surprised instructors who had assumed her request was driven by grief rather than genuine mechanical aptitude. By the time she reached the front with the 26th Guards Tank Brigade, she was not a passenger inside a machine she had purchased. She was its driver mechanic, responsible for keeping a 30-ton armored vehicle combat capable through some of the most brutal fighting of the war on the Eastern Front. The T-34 was a formidable weapon, but it was also a demanding one to maintain. Its diesel engine required constant attention to oil pressure and cooling systems that overheated rapidly under combat load. Its tracks, subjected to the pounding of uneven terrain and shell fragments, threw links and required field repairs that could take hours even with proper equipment and daylight. Under combat conditions with equipment scarce and time measured in minutes rather than hours, those repairs became something closer to improvisation performed under artillery fire. This was the environment Oktyabrskaya operated in daily, not as an occasional volunteer stepping outside her role, but as the crew member whose specific job was to diagnose why the engine was losing power, why a track had jammed, why the machine that carried 4 other soldiers into direct combat had suddenly stopped moving in the middle of a firefight. Her first combat engagement came near Novoye Selo in October 1943, and it established immediately that Oktyabrskaya intended to fight rather than simply survive behind armor plating. Fighting Girlfriend advanced ahead of supporting infantry, crushed a German machine gun position under its tracks, and continued forward through defensive fire that destroyed lesser vehicles. Partway through the engagement, the tank sustained damage that knocked out its mobility, precisely the mechanical failure that threatened to leave the crew stranded in the middle of an active battlefield with no protection beyond the armor of a machine that could no longer move. Oktyabrskaya did not wait for a repair crew. She left the relative safety of the hull, stepped outside into direct enemy fire, and personally repaired the mechanical fault that had disabled the tank, understanding that a stationary tank on a modern battlefield was, in effect, a fixed artillery target waiting for the enemy to find its range. She restored mobility to the vehicle under fire and continued the assault. This pattern repeated itself across the following months. Fighting Girlfriend fought through engagements near Smolensk, and later through the brutal terrain of Belarus. And at multiple points, Oktyabrskaya left the protection of the tank's hull to conduct field repairs, while combat continued around her, treating the mechanical survival of her vehicle as an active extension of the fight itself, rather than a technical afterthought handled once the shooting stopped. Soviet commanders who had initially approved her unusual request as something between a public relations gesture and a compassionate allowance for a grieving widow began filing reports that described her differently, as a competent and disciplined crew member whose mechanical proficiency directly extended the combat life of her vehicle in situations where other tanks were abandoned or destroyed. The technical brilliance of what Oktyabrskaya accomplished is easy to understate from a modern distance. Field repair of a T-34's mechanical systems under fire required not just courage, but genuine engineering literacy, an understanding of how the diesel engine's fuel injection system responded to combat stress, how track tension needed adjusting after impact damage, and how to make triage decisions about which mechanical failures could be patched enough to keep fighting and which required withdrawal. She had taught herself this knowledge in a matter of months, starting from a position of complete formal exclusion from military mechanical training, and she applied it in conditions that experienced male tank crews found punishing even with full institutional support behind them. By January 1944, fighting near Vitebsk in what is now Belarus, Fighting Girlfriend was engaged in an assault against entrenched German positions when the tank sustained a direct hit that disabled it once again. Oktyabrskaya, following the same instinct that had defined her service since Novoye Selo, left the tank to conduct emergency repairs under fire. This time the enemy fire found her. She was struck by shrapnel and critically wounded, falling unconscious on the battlefield beside the machine she had spent her savings, her mechanical education, and ultimately her life defending. She was evacuated and treated, but never regained consciousness, dying in a military hospital in March 1944. The Soviet government posthumously awarded her the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military honor, recognizing a service record built almost entirely on a foundation the Red Army had never designed for a widow with no formal engineering background. Fighting Girlfriend, the tank itself, continued fighting with a new crew after her death, carrying forward a name that had become inseparable from the woman who financed it, learned to repair it, and insisted on driving it into direct combat rather than accepting a support role behind the front line. What makes Oktyabrskaya's story resist easy categorization is that it was never really about grief alone, though grief is what set it in motion. It was about a woman who looked at the most mechanically demanding, physically punishing role inside an armored crew, and decided that grief gave her not permission to mourn quietly, but justification to master an entirely new technical discipline in record time, and apply it under conditions that killed experienced soldiers who had trained for years. She did not ask to be protected from the machine's mechanical failures. She positioned herself as the person responsible for solving them in real time, under fire, for months, until the war finally caught up with her outside the hull of the tank she had built. The wreckage of a marriage cut short by war produced, through a path no military planner could have designed, one of the most technically proficient and personally committed armored vehicle crew members of the entire Eastern Front campaign. Fighting girlfriend rolled forward long after Maria Oktyabrskaya could no longer ride inside it, but the machine never stopped being hers. She had built it from nothing, kept it moving through some of the war's harshest fighting with her own hands, and left it running one final time before the front finally took what the loss of her husband had already tried to take from her once before. History has kept stories like this one buried for decades, filed away as footnotes instead of the frontline accounts they actually are. Every dusty page still hides a name history forgot to remember. Follow Iron Women Archives, and let's keep prying those pages open, one forgotten woman at a time.